These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob was 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers, and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live."
Sydney, the Exodus is, I think it's fair to say, it's the central story for Israel's identity, the deliverance from slavery, the coming to Mount Sinai and getting the law, and also getting the tabernacle on Mount Sinai. It's the central story in Exodus.
Absolutely.
But we have a little problem sometimes, don't we? The historical evidence for Exodus is something that is curious, I think, to some people, may even cause them some difficulties. And maybe we can talk a little bit about Israel in history and in Egypt.
Mm-hmm. We want to be careful, though, I think, not to get too hung up on history in our sense. We have a very narrow definition of history. You know, we think that if it's historical, we should be able to go to the library and look up our evidence and set it out and just prove it. And that's a very empirical, post-Enlightenment notion of history. And of course, the Israelites didn't have that notion of history. They don't worry. They didn't have a lending library to go to. And so when they told their own history, when they told themselves who they were as a people, they didn't expect the challenge of, well, how do you know that's right? They were simply saying, this is who we are, and this is who we understand ourselves to be, and who we understand our God to be. And that's the central message, I think. So the archaeological evidence is very interesting, and I'm an archaeologist, and I love to excavate, and it's great fun, and it shows us all kinds of things. But we should be very careful in the stories of the Exodus not to get hung up on that question and miss the wider point.
Well, the Israelites were Semitic peoples. They weren't Egyptian, they were Semitic people. What sort of evidence is there for Semitic people being in Egypt? Because that's a big story. When Joseph and his family come down into Egypt, they're there for a fairly long time, according to Genesis. But is there archaeological evidence for that sort of thing?
Well, we know that in the Middle Bronze Age, which is about maybe the 15th century BCE, there was an invasion into Egypt of a people that the Egyptians call the Hyksos, who seem to have been a Semitic people. That is, they spoke a Semitic language like Hebrew or Aramaic or modern-day Arabic. That's a language family. And they had a different culture than the Egyptians. And they conquered Egypt and ruled it for a long period of time. And then the Egyptians managed to revolt against that and throw them out. But there's also evidence in the Egyptian records for smaller scale migrations down into Egypt from the north, what would be north for Egypt, especially in times of famine or crisis. People would just come, they were seeking food or shelter or peace in some way.
And we have those stories in Genesis, right, of going down into Egypt for famine reasons. Right?
Exactly, and we find them also in the Egyptian records, so that we know these things happened. And so what the Israelites say, this is when they say in the story of Joseph, this is how we got into Egypt, it makes perfect sense historically that this is what would have happened. Now, we don't have any place in Egypt where we can say, the Israelites left a calling card, we were here. We wouldn't expect that either. But the story itself makes perfect sense within the broader cultural context of the late Bronze Age.
So we can say, perhaps, from an archaeological point of view, it fits and makes sense. But that's very different from proving it, let's say, in a modern sense of the word, where you can open a book and point to something and say, there it is, it happened.
Absolutely. And that's why I want to reiterate my warning not to get hung up on that, because that can just become sort of an obsession that leads away from the real point of the story.
But what if nothing happened at all, and it's all made up, right? So what value? A question people often ask is, what value does the story have if there's no historical connection at all? Mm-hmm. So how do we think through that?
That's a hard question, and of course there are. You can open textbooks on the Old Testament or books on the Exodus, and scholars will argue that since there is no outside evidence for the Exodus, that we can't say it ever happened. First of all, I think that discounts the book of Exodus as a historical source of any kind, and I don't think that's quite fair. It's not a historical source in our sense of the word, but the fact that this story that they tell about themselves repeats and repeats and repeats throughout the Hebrew Bible in various forms, I think really indicates that there's a historical kernel here. Can we ever get a hold of the details? Maybe not. But that kernel exists. Having said that, the theological point of the story is for the Israelites that God brought them out of a place where they were strangers. And they understand God's action in that moment, and that moment formed them as a people. That moment is to them as important as, say, the crucifixion is in Christianity. If you asked an ancient Israelite, who are the Israelites? He would start out by saying, We were strangers in Egypt, and God brought us out. That's who the Israelites are. That's how a Jew would begin that story as well.
So maybe our focus when we read these books, Genesis and Exodus, is to think more in terms of what is this saying about what it means to be an Israelite? What is this saying about who God is, really?
That this is a God who is with them no matter what. That this God travels with them, and that this God sticks with them, even in circumstances where they're the down and outs. They don't need to be the guys on top for this God to continue to be their God. In a sense, it's a mystery why God chooses Israel. They're not any better than any other people, but God has chosen Israel, and because that's happened, they have to respond to it. And that response begins in the story of Israel in Egypt and the Exodus from Egypt.